The night had a neat, hard edge to it. Wind knifing down the avenue, the snow on the curb packing into a thin, glassy crust that reflected the streetlights like broken mirrors. Henry stood with his back to a shuttered deli, shoulders hunched inside an olive jacket gone threadbare at the elbows, a manila folder tucked under one arm. The folder contained pages that had once meant everything. Résumés with careful type and neat dates. A small list of references written in a looping hand. And now they made a softer kind of noise when the wind tried to take them. He watched the breath from his mouth make brief, dumb clouds. Watched a bus disgorge late commuters who pressed toward the underground in small, urgent clumps. And felt again the particular hollowness that came at the edges of a January night. Hunger, cold, the worn ache of missing someone you had promised forever to. She appeared out of the falling light like any other city-bred silhouette. A coat with clean lines, a scarf wound with practiced care, the kind of woman who stepped into wind as if it were her element. Her shoes made a sharp sound on the wet pavement. She checked her watch with fingers that did not need to be warmed, and smiled politely at the driver who paused to listen to a complaint. When she moved closer to the shelter of the deli awning, Henry realized the band of her coat was the exact dull green of the folder he carried. For a ridiculous second, he thought of the world as ordered by colors. She shivered. She reached for the collar of her coat and laughed under her breath in a way that might have been embarrassed or glad. The temperature had the sort of cruelty that could melt the rigidness out of strangers. Henry was aware, with the clear, stubborn clarity of a man who has rehearsed kindness enough that it has become muscle memory, that he had a coat that would be warmer than his own. He had been carrying it for days. The salvation of an old coat that had belonged to no one, a find behind the sanitation doors of the warehouse behind his truck. He had kept it because it was in small ways practical, and because it had pockets deep enough for little things. He stepped forward before he had decided to and offered it. "It's cold tonight," he said, like a man making a transaction between two people who both already knew what manner of world they inhabited. The woman glanced at him, neutral eyes under lashes that were damp with snow, and then down at the coat he held out. Her hand hovered for a moment, then took the fabric. She smelled of citrus soap and metal. When she found the pocket and her fingers brushed something folded inside, she froze like a child who has discovered a hidden treasure. She pulled it out, and the wind dimmed for a beat. It was a drawing, crayons in a clumsy, earnest swirl of color, a stick figure with hair like a halo, two scribbled suns in opposite corners, a large heart that had been traced again and again. In one corner, a blocky word, Daddy. On the back, in a small, careful hand, a name and a promise half smudged by the wet. Claire had been a careful person by habit and design, careful with speech, with risk, with the way she allowed herself to be seen. For years, the careful had been armor. But the drawing took something loose and bright out of her, like summer air. Her throat made a small, involuntary sound. Who, she began. Henry watched her face clear into a map of recognition. Not of him, not yet, but of the thing that had been lost and was suddenly in her hand. He smiled with a sudden frankness that surprised him. The teeth were white against the dusk. "It looked like it wanted a house," he said, "and my boy drew it for me." Claire looked up then, and the city, for 2 seconds, rearranged itself around the shape of her. The wind caught at her scarf, and Henry saw the set of her jaw, the way she kept her chin tucked against the cold, the precise way she kept the world at bay from whatever corners were still tender. She had the kind of plenitude that wealth sometimes gives, a posture that assumed the world would fall into place if she simply moved with enough force. But behind that, she carried a fatigue like an old bruise. "You should take this," she said, and it came out wrong, as if she had been giving the coat back to him. She stuffed the drawing into the pocket instead, and slid the coat up her shoulders. It fit oddly, draped like a promise too big for a single body. Henry felt unexpectedly that she looked utterly restored. Claire closed the coat around herself as if it were a small private celebration. Outside the awning, the buses rumbled and a streetlight blinked. For a moment, the city was only that small exchange: breath, fabric, a drawing that smelled faintly of crayons. Henry's fingers found the folder again and tightened. Before the scene got any more ordinary, before the two of them could turn away and become two people with separate maps back to Midtown and to the shelter row, Claire looked at him again. "Thank you," she said. It was the kind of thing that could mean everything and nothing. He nodded, which meant more than he could say. If someone had asked, later, whether that coat had been the most important thing Henry had ever given away, he would have said yes. It was small enough to carry, but it began a chain. The coat was practical. It was also a permission. It allowed a woman who had built her life on order to allow herself a foolish, human act of gratitude. It allowed Henry to stand not on the edge of the sidewalk, but in the center of a brief exchange, where two people recognized their own fragility in one another. And once something that honest slipped between strangers, there was no evilly putting it back. If you want to stay with this story until the end, hit subscribe and like. There's more ahead about how one small act moved the lives of many. Claire folded the drawing, and against the cold let her fingers trace the child's uneven letters. Henry watched the way her mouth pressed into thought. He told himself he would not look at the watch he did not have, would not measure the seconds in that small act. He had learned the economy of not measuring things that mattered by time. People, he had discovered, did not return to you on schedule. Later, months after the coat, there would be a photograph taken in a small sunlit room at Thomas's place that would show her laughing with her head thrown back and a tiny smudge of crayon on her thumb. People would remark on how unlikely it was that a tech CEO would be elbow-deep in a community craft table. But the truth of how it had started was a quiet one: a coat, a drawing, a breath of surprise. Henry kept walking, the folder clutched at his side. The truck he slept in, an old work rig with a heater that coughed to life when coaxed, sat behind a wholesale bakery. It smelled faintly of yeast and was warm enough to thaw fingers slower than the street. Inside, a framed photo of Lily in a dress she liked and Noah's mismatched socks were proof against the erosion of a life. The photo of Lily had been his talisman for years, her hair like copper and a smile that had been the hinge of everything. When she died, the world lost its axis. Henry learned how to measure brief by the small chores it left undone. He went to sleep with the folder on his chest and dreamed of blueprints and beams that shifted and settled like old mistakes made right. He woke before dawn, did the errands he could do, retired steel, odd jobs at the market, and in the pauses between tasks he rehearsed the kind of future people make: a rented room with a cheap bed, a job that made sense of a reluctant skill, the return of a boy who had been fostered out of the county the year the mortgage went unpaid. There was a stubbornness to Henry, the same practical stubbornness that had made him a good structural engineer before the world rearranged itself. He knew how to hold weight and how to shift it without breaking what stood under it. Claire walked away in the coat like someone who had allowed herself an indulgence. When she reached her car, a sleek thing that sat like a sheet of glass against the snow, she turned the drawing over and studied the handwriting. The name on the back was a child's name, messy and hopeful. Claire had been in foster care. Small things like that drew her. She kept that corner of her life private, like a wound you learn to dress in the dark. The city had asked for sacrifice and given her a certain kind of armor. She accepted the armor because that was the way a person survived the corporate climb. But tonight, something else slid beneath the armor, the old ache, not of want, but of recognition. Claire had been a careful listener of stories that were not her own. It was partly professional curiosity. Her company, Infinity Group, mined human problems for product. But mostly it was a private habit she carried from a childhood when listening had been a way to keep from being noticed. She kept a small notebook for moments that mattered. A tulip she saw on a February walk, a line someone had said about courage, a child's drawing with a crooked heart. She wrote the date beside such things, and later, when life allowed, she turned them into directives. Small projects at the community center, a charity fund, a program where one coat could become an opportunity. 3 days later, she returned to the spot where Henry had been standing, part curiosity, part the weightless need to know where something had come from. The city had a way of erasing the precise maps of human exchange, but she remembered the window of the shuttered deli and the man with the folder and the sound of his voice in the wind. She walked in the shallow light of a day that had already lost its sparkle, and stood looking at the awning like a child trying to find a lost step. There was a homeless encampment near the loading docks, tents and sleeping bags folded and flattened, a life organized in parched order. She did not want to make a spectacle of herself. She wanted to ask a question without broadcasting the fact that she knew that small secret had changed her. She asked a woman at the bakery where Henry might have gone. The woman, Maria, who had a thumb stained with flour and the kind of blunt courage that made the bakery hum, told her there was an old man who slept behind the wholesale doors sometimes, and sometimes he worked odd jobs stacking pallets. She gave Claire a faded napkin with a drawn map and a shrug. It was not a beginning of some grandiloquent plan. It was a human routing, like giving a stranger an umbrella. Claire followed the lines on the napkin. She found Henry's truck behind the warehouse, a battered cab with air freshener perfume leaking into the cold like a parody of domestic life. He was not inside. She waited, feeling ridiculous and strange, like someone in a movie who arrives at a crucial moment between scenes. Then he came, carrying 2 buckets and the kind of careful gait that said he had been up before dawn. He had the look of a man who kept his burdens organized like tools. When he saw her, he did not startle. There was no reason he should have. People in his world did not normally find themselves on the receiving end of curiosity from a CEO. "You bought the coat," he said simply. She smiled, then decided on another truth. "You gave it," she corrected. Her voice softened, the first real thaw. There was an awkwardness between them, not an unkindness, but the peculiar discomfort of people whose social worlds had been adjacent until a small human law bent them together. She told him, without pretense, about the drawing. He told her, in a voice that never wasted words, about Noah, the way he had been small enough to fit into a drawer and leave a sock behind that had become impossible to match. "Why help me?" Henry asked at one point, and the question landed like a pebble in a pond. Claire had to think, and it was not the corporate answer. It was a little older and truer. She had once been a child who needed someone to notice, and she had been lucky enough to be rescued by order. She looked at him and said, "Because sometimes noticing is the work." What followed was not swift. Claire asked an assistant, Rachel, quick and skeptical and yet secretly sentimental by inclination, to see if there were any records of a man named Henry signing in at a community center called Thomas's Place. Rachel, always efficient, made calls and sent notes with the clatter of fingers that translated concern into work. She came back with a list of times Henry had been seen doing odd maintenance jobs, repairing the back stair, fixing a broken shelf, coaxing the rusted kettle into boiling for a crowded Sunday morning. He was a man who fixed things. Claire felt a permission open inside her, like a window. It was quiet and sharp. Wealth, she had learned, could blunt a person. Walls rose because money bought distance. But at the sight of Henry repairing a kettle for a bunch of children who drank tea out of mismatched mugs, her world tilted. She began to see, in the small rust and the careful hands, a set of skills she had never valued, because her world did not often require a hand used to unbending metal or to reading the stress lines in an old floorboard. She saw competence that was not CV ready, but life ready. She offered him work at Infinity Group as an advisor. It was a practical position, part consultant on facilities for a new community program, part mentorship for the team developing low-cost housing prototypes. The board raised eyebrows. A CEO offering an open-ended position to a man who slept in his truck would have to be explained. Claire explained it in a set of precise sentences seasoned with a sincerity that made debate moot. Henry would come in twice a week at first, bring his folder, and show the young engineers the ways that things could actually be made to stand. There was resistance, internal memos questioning the optics, but there was also the small, stubborn force of Claire's will. Henry accepted, with 2 reservations. He could not promise more than his presence, and he would need to find a place to keep his tools. Claire found him a small office, plain, with a single desk and a heat register that worked, and an envelope with a check that would cover a deposit on a modest room in East Brooklyn. The company lawyer set down the specifics in the language of contracts, and Henry signed on a shaky line that read like a promise. At first, Henry felt awkward in the Infinity lobby, a space of glass and quiet power where every corner smelled faintly of new leather and anticipatory coffee. He watched young men and women who had been trained to nod in the right cadence and to reference the right case studies. He felt like an outsider again, but a helpful outsider. He spent the days teaching interns how to read a wall, how to respect load-bearing beams, and how to think of design as a friend of human life rather than a way to impress. The interns came to him with notebooks and questions. He answered with concrete sentences that sometimes translated into ideas that surprised them. A suggestion about how to anchor a foundation became a cheaper, safer prototype for an affordable housing module. The project took on the peculiar miracle of collaboration. What started as a spare coat and a drawing became a design brief for people who had never slept outside. Claire watched Henry move through the company like a quiet tide. He was not loud. He did not ask the young designers to genuflect to his knowledge. He told stories of working with steel during summers when he and Lily tried to save for a house. He kept a joke about the shape of the world. The office changed in subtle, human ways. The recycled coffee mugs stopped being trophies and began to look like shared vessels. Someone painted the narrow hallway a warm ochre that made the fluorescent lights feel less like interrogation. Employees began bringing in plants that required patience. They brought in bread on Fridays and left sticky notes that said thanks on the prototype boards. Noah came back in a slow arc that had the softness of melting. The boy, who had once been young enough to be held in Henry's arms, arrived at the East Brooklyn room uncertain and tall, hair curling at the neck, a backpack that still had a superhero patch. Their reunion was careful. Henry had learned how to do the small rituals that mending possible, programs for visitation, calls, and letters that were consistent and predictable. Noah had been in a foster home that required rules and had found people who loved him for the person he was, angry and bright in equal measure. When he first visited the office, he stood in the doorway and watched Henry explain a join with the sort of interest that made Henry's chest ache and float at once. Noah stayed. He began to help on weekends, sweeping the prototype workshop, learning to count the rough lengths of lumber, and to like the honest tool grit of manual work. He and Henry rebuilt a small garden plot behind the company and planted tomato starts that came up against all expectations. The boy taught Henry how to navigate a new generation's speech, and Henry taught Noah how to use a level so the tomatoes would not lean. The smallest acts, cookies shared over late-night drawings, a postcard sent from a trip, built a quiet architecture stronger than any of Henry's early projects. Claire watched the two of them together sometimes from the doorway of her office and felt a rope pull inside her chest that was at once tender and terrifying. Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "and chest that was at once tender and terrifying." Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. And then there was the day the gynecologist walked into the room. He arrived early, hands tucked into a wool coat, a man with the posture of someone used to leaning over small things, pregnant bellies, sweet, secret panoramas of life. Dr. Marcus had been at Thomas's place many times over the years, a volunteer clinician who offered prenatal workshops for women who could not easily get to clinics uptown. He had been a soft, steady presence in the neighborhoods where births and the quiet decisions of family made or broke the shape of the next generation. He was also someone who, in the private geography of his life, had once carried an impossible small grief, the memory of a young woman he had loved years before, a foster child named Claire, who had vanished into the world and into a life of precise edges before he could say anything worth keeping. He did not expect to find her again. He did not want to find her. He only wanted to open the room for the prenatal class, to lay out pamphlets and tea. When he walked into the multi-purpose community room, where the coat hung framed on the wall and where a circle of folding chairs had been set for discussion, Claire stood in the center, smoothing a paper placemat with the sort of distracted concentration she had when managing several things at once. She laughed at something Henry said and reached for a mug of tea. Marcus's breath seemed to stop at the exact moment the door closed behind him. The man of medicine had given up on the comfortable illusions of destiny a long time ago. People's bodies were messy but teachable, and the small miracles of recovery lived in orders and aftercare. When he saw Claire with her hand brushing against Henry's sleeve, looking utterly unafraid to be seen, something uncoiled in him. The love he had lost years ago, careful, cautious, and adolescent devotion that he had never had the courage to declare, was not the same as it had been. It had grown complicated and older. He realized in a surprising warmth that felt like rediscovery rather than regret, that what he had lost had taken a human shape he could recognize. The capacity to hope, not for himself, but for the flourishing of someone else he had once loved. He had not expected to feel the heart stir in that way. He had not expected to feel gratitude. He had meant to offer medical counseling and leave. Instead, he found himself staying, drawn into the conversation, sharing a private anecdote about a difficult birth, the kind of story told to soothe fear with an honest, measured tone. He watched Claire listen, her face open in a way he had not seen since she had been a child at Thomas's place, and he felt something like a benediction. Later, when he sat alone with a cup at the folding table, his hands clasped around the too-hot ceramic cup, he allowed himself a small, foolish thought. Perhaps he had found once again the love he lost years ago. It was not to be returned as it had been. Claire had built a life, and it was not Marcus's place to undo that. Mas o tom e a força vocal deve ser firme e inabalável. But the feeling was there, a recovered patience, a recovered capacity to care in a new register. If he had once thought of loving as a personal possession, he now recognized it as a communal asset. Seeing Claire thrive and give, seeing Henry made whole, he recognized that the love he had thought gone had been redistributed into the world and had become, in a clarifying way, larger. That night, after the prenatal session, Marcus walked home with a small, awkward smile. He had not expected the coat to mean anything to him, but there it was, framed and simple on the wall, a token that had moved hands and hearts like a pebble in a lake. He remembered the very first time he'd seen Claire, a girl with her hair tied too tight and a mouth full of questions that she swallowed like coins. He had tried, in his clumsy, adult way, to make a small safety net. Life, it seemed, had worked another sort of safety net for her. Meanwhile, inside Infinity Group, the change that Henry had set in motion continued. Interns found themselves taking the long view more readily. Budget lines were reframed to fund the prototypes Henry and a small team had built for modular, affordable shelters. A young engineer, Samir, took to Henry like a brother. Henry taught him how to weld and how to listen to the grain of a board before it broke. Samir, in turn, brought Henry homemade samosas on the days the workshop ran late. Small rituals knit people to place. Claire watched the experiments begin to work. The first prototype unit, a tidy one-room design that could be stacked and adapted, passed safety tests and was adopted for a pilot installation near Thomas's place. It was not a panacea. The pilot addressed one slice of a larger problem, but the pilot used materials sourced locally and employed a handful of men and women who had been out of steady work. Noah contributed with a small crew that taught children to read the grain of wood and to paint doors. The community cheered at the opening. Someone played a battered trumpet, and people who had been skeptical wept quietly. The coat, forever threaded through these small triumphs, became the symbol that neither demanded grandiosity nor revered itself. It had a place on the wall, with a plaque that read simply and without fanfare, "Where one thing was given, many things grew." People at the community center would stop to touch the frame and trace with their fingers the spot where the fabric had once been mended. Children were allowed to sit near it and tell the story of the coat, and they did so with the thrill of myth-makers. The coat's story was not a marketing campaign. It was an orientation for how people could move through the world. Recognition Day was planned as a modest celebration, a one-kindness day that used the coat's narrative as a springboard for telling other stories of small acts. The company's communications team wanted to orchestrate it for donors and to show a highlight reel. Claire insisted the storytelling be more than highlight. She wanted people who came to feel less like consumers of goodness and more like participants. The event was to be held at Thomas's place. Henry was to be given a quiet acknowledgement for his work with the prototypes and for reuniting with Noah. The room filled with folding chairs and the smell of coffee and lemon cookies. A small stage had been set with a microphone and a banner made by the children, a banner with crooked letters that declared, "You matter." People from the neighborhood, Infinity Group's volunteers, and a scattering of local reporters congregated under strings of white lights that made the room look like a contained sky. Dr. Marcus walked in with a small group of colleagues who had volunteered in the prenatal program. He paused at the doorway and saw Claire already there, helping a woman with a stroller negotiate the step. Henry stood near the back, hands tucked into his pockets, blue-collared shirt warm against his ribs. He smiled at the way the room hummed, a community in the literal sense, people orbiting one another with the gravity of shared purpose. When the MC called Henry to the small stage, the room quieted. He stepped up with a modest stoop and accepted a plaque that read, "For a life of practical kindness." He thought, briefly, of Lily and of the way she had told him, years ago, that concrete acts mattered more than lofty promises. He held the small award and felt a warmth like light at his back. Then Claire stepped forward. She spoke with an economy of spectacle that made the words land. She spoke of a night in January, of a hand extended on an awning, of a drawing that had been found in a pocket. She told the story with a careful humor and with an honesty that made the room smile and then, quietly, weep. Henry listened and felt something inside him unspool into a space that made room for more than grief. After the scripted remarks, when the microphones were parked and the coffee was cooling, Henry found Claire alone near the framed coat. He took her hand in the way people take a handle on a ladder and stepped toward her as if a ladder was what they needed. "Do you remember when you first found it?" he asked. She laughed like someone reclaiming a small private island. "I thought the coat had fixed me." He brushed a thumb along the frame where the cloth met the glass. "It did," he said quietly. He did not mean it literally, and she did not pretend otherwise. The coat had been a lever. It had helped pry open things that were stuck. He turned then with the slow, unhurried courage of a man who had learned to measure risk differently. He had an old ring in his pocket, a ring that had belonged to him before Lily had been ill, a ring that held the memory of vows and the shape of promise. He drew it out and held it in both hands like an offering. The room, in its honest domestic noise, seemed very far and very near. "Claire," he said, and the name sat in the air like a thing both tender and formidable. "Will you marry me?" There was no grand knell of fate, no impossible proposal like those found in movies. He offered the ring. Claire's breath caught, and the smile she gave broke into something softer and more definitive than agreement. She took his hands in hers and answered not with words immediately, but with a gesture, a slow, deliberate nod, and then the beginning of speech. Yes, she said, but what she meant, what she had been finding in Henry all this time, was a partnership forged in both grief and action. She said yes, not to the rescue narrative, but to the work that marriage would mean. Holding each other honest in small things, welcoming each other's pasts without domination, letting their separate histories be pieces of a shared table. People in the room who had been strangers a moment before broke into applause as friends did, cautious and delighted. Standing at the periphery, Dr. Marcus felt a complex, gentle ache. He had never intended to be an obstacle in anyone's life. He had only wished, years ago, that a love could have different shape. Watching Claire accept Henry's ring, he did the strange adult thing of feeling both the prickle of an old grief and the calm of a recovered conviction. Love, he thought, existed in many registers. Sometimes love had to be a sacrament. Sometimes it had to be the small daily craft of fixing a leaky kettle or keeping a promise to a boy. Marcus felt, as he often did after a long night on call where a healthy baby murmured against its mother's chest, that the world had made a wholly decent choice. The wedding was modest and held at Thomas's place in the late spring when the light softened like bread. The coat was displayed in a place of honor but not ostentation, a quiet relic framed against a wall of handmade quilts. Friends and community members arrived, some in suits, some in jeans, some with sunburned forearms from work in the prototype lots. They carried dishes for a potluck, a symbol that the meal would be made by many hands and shared by many mouths. Noah walked with Henry down the narrow aisle between chairs. Claire stood beside a small table with a bouquet that had been put together by volunteers who knew how to wrap a sprig of rosemary with a ribbon and call it grace. Dr. Marcus, who had come with a modest gift, 2 plant starts from his window garden and a handwritten note, sat at the back and watched the room fill with a kind of ordinary holiness. The ceremony was not about public spectacle. It was about bringing together the work they had nurtured, community, a livelihood that respected life, and the slow mending of family fractures. They exchanged vows with a precision that was honest rather than grand. Henry's voice cracked on the first line, and Claire laughed, a sound that had the relief of a valve opened. They promised to be present and to build rather than erase the parts of themselves that had been shattered. They promised to honor the child who was not a romantic third, but a committed, loved member of their new unit. Afterward, people danced under strings of light. Children played in a corner with blocks and beads. A violinist, borrowed from a neighbor's wedding, played thin, ecstatic songs that made everyone press their foreheads together and laugh. The smell of rosemary and warm bread collected in the room like a blessing. At the reception, Dr. Marcus found a moment to speak with Claire alone, an exchange that did not require confession or apology. He gave her the plant starts and said quietly, "You look at home now." Claire held his gaze and smiled, and he felt in his chest something tenderly resolved. He had found in that crowded room not the romantic reclamation of a youth, but the recovery of a principle, that love, when given, when held, when distributed, returns in forms you never expected. Henry and Claire left later that night with a small bouquet and the plan to make their home a practical, warm place. Noah would have a room with a desk and a place for his sketches. Henry would make sure the door was level. Claire would learn, slowly and with good faith, how to thrift and mend a shirt without delegating the work away. They moved into a modest house that had a deed titled in Henry and Claire's names, stamped and made official, the paperwork ringed with the small bureaucracy that nevertheless meant permanence. They framed Lily's photograph in their living room, not an altar to loss, but a witness to what had been and what would be carried forward. Years later, when someone asked Dr. Marcus at a neighborhood fundraiser if he had ever regretted not returning to Claire years before, he would answer with the careful humor he favored. Love has the odd habit of showing up in rooms you do not expect, he said, and he would mean it. He would mean that he had walked into a room once and found a girl and an entire story he had once held fragile. He had found that the love he thought was lost had been repurposed by life into something larger and more generous. The coat remained on the wall at Thomas's place, its fabric gently faded, the thread mended in one careful place. Children who visited would run their fingers along the glass and imagine themselves inside the story. Adults would come and sit on a bench near the frame and remember the first little kindness they had ever offered someone. The barnacled city around them moved on, indifferent and brilliant. But inside that small room, with light through the window like a slow benediction, people learned again that small things could tilt the world. Henry, some mornings, still touched the ring he had offered Claire.